This edition of the Pest Geek Podcast is brought to you by Pest Routes. Pest Routes, supercharge your company with Pest Routes, the #1 pest control software to help you dominate your goals. Visit them at pestroutes.com and get your free demo.
Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek Podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek Podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube, we're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant. Hey, I wanted to talk to you a little about understanding risk. How do we talk about risk? How do you explain the chances of something going wrong to your clients who are afraid of what you're going to be doing? I think this is one of the most difficult concepts for pest control operators or wildlife control operators to discuss with their clients, because the fact is we tend to exalt the chances of something going wrong when we're dealing with something we're not familiar with. Take, for example, driving. Why is it that people think that driving is safer than flying? Even though we've all heard the statistics, it says driving is infinitely more dangerous than flying. But people would rather drive than fly. Why is that? Well, part of that is because people are more familiar with driving than they are with flying. And so therefore, there's a sense of a loss of control. You have to trust two pilots up in the front of that plane. And when you don't understand something, you tend to exaggerate and exalt the risk. But I also think there's another element to it, and that is people intuitively understand that when something goes wrong with a plane, the results tend to be rather catastrophic. You can have a lot of fender benders in cars and no one's getting killed. But with a plane, when something goes wrong, it can go really wrong. And so the idea that sometimes we have to understand risk as the potential for how serious the effects are going to be. Even if those risks are minute or extraordinarily rare, people tend to take less risk when the consequences are severe. So there's a psychological component. But let me back up a little bit and let's talk about risk. Many of you have probably had risk explained to you as a formula, sort of like risk equals the toxicity times exposure. And that was your understanding of risk. And that's really a good thumbnail way of understanding what risk is in terms of explaining to your client. And that is, clearly, if you're using an herbicide, that's going to pose probably less toxic ingredients to a human per se than, let's say, using a rodenticide or a fumigant that may be killing rodents. And then you'd have to just calculate what level of exposure is this person going to have. So we could obviously reduce the risk by making sure the client's not home, the item is dry before the client comes back, the re-entry interval, and that sort of thing. But there's more to risk than simply that, because giving some of those concepts of risk, toxicity, does your client really understand toxicity? I mean, look at all the stuff that's on the internet now, that we're poisoning ourselves. People are looking at, they found 1/billionth of a percentage of ingredient in something, and therefore it's contaminated. Because the public doesn't understand that there's a difference between presence of something and the significance of that presence. We have chemicals that we're exposed to all over the place. The question is not just whether they're there, but is there an actual effect or harm that we can measure? And the reality is a lot of these things is, yeah, we can find it. We have testing equipment today that can find things down to the billionth part, which is an exceedingly small amount. But then the question is, all right, just because we found it, is it significant? Well, that's like asking, is the gravity that is exerted against you by the apple in your hand, is that significant, right? I mean, so where do we go? Where do we end with this, right? So clearly, it's hard to explain some of these concepts. So let's reiterate what that original risk formula was. Risk equals toxicity times exposure. And so toxicity is, what are those consequences, such as morbidity? And morbidity is how will it injure someone or something. Mortality is what is the likelihood of it killing somebody. So that would be the toxicity or the severity of that particular pesticide. Exposure refers to how often is the person being exposed, frequency, how long is that exposure going to occur? In other words, is it going to be 2 seconds or 20 hours or 20 years? And then to what extent is that exposure? In other words, is it just part of their body? Is it all of their body? Are they inhaling it? Or is it absorbed through the skin? Are they eating it? So what kind of exposure? What's the extent of the exposure? So you can see how when we talk about risk, it's a complicated concept, and I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated for you here. And that is, I think we need to add a third component, probability. What is the likelihood of a negative event occurring? So let's revisit that formula again. Now, the original formula I gave you was risk equals toxicity, or the severity of a pesticide, times the exposure. But what if we add a third element, namely, what is the probability of that exposure? In other words, we can fumigate a building, let's say, with aluminum phosphide, if you're in this place where it has dry wood termites or something, and you're fumigating with aluminum phosphide or methyl bromide or something along those guys. I'm not an expert in bugs, but there are various fumigants out there. And, if someone walks into that building that's being fumigated, they're going to die. So it's a highly toxic fumigant, but if we ventilate that building and do the proper measurements to ensure that it's properly aerated, your client could walk back in. So what's the probability that something bad is going to happen to your client? Well, it's basically zero. So even though the toxicity of this particular product is extraordinarily high, this fumigant, and the exposure level may be very low in the sense you don't have to be exposed very long, fumigants tend to kill rather quickly, all that's irrelevant if you can remove the probability, make the probability a zero. So how severely toxic something is irrelevant if you can eliminate the probability that this person's going to be exposed. Now let's take this a little bit less abstract and bring it down to your dog, for instance. I get questions in my line of work and people ask me, will this hurt my dog? And my answer is, yeah, it'll kill your dog. And then they get scared and I say, well, you can tie your dog up. Tying your dog up, if your dog can't get to the poison, your dog is going to be fine. So we can eliminate some of the risks to our pesticide use simply by eliminating the likelihood or reducing the likelihood of exposure to zero. And so we need to be sure when we talk to clients that, just telling them about the severity of the particular product, the exposure of that product, we also have to think about what's the probability of something going wrong. Because it's all about choice. What is the good, what benefits does this pesticide provide? And what are the risks that the pesticide provides? How do we minimize those risks of the negative elements of that pesticide without giving up the benefits of those pesticides? And this is where it can be very difficult because we're developing a culture in our society that says all pesticides are bad, where people are not quite understanding the chemistry, the biology, and the risk of these particular products and the benefits that they provide, and how we minimize the risk by things like simple follow the label. So that's how I talk about risk in terms of a part 1 edition. Part 1. But there's more to talk about risk in terms of the psychology and the components of risk that we need to be sure that we understand so that we can try to help our clients be informed consumers and not just simply those who panic because they heard the boogeyman word of pesticide. So how do we do that? Let's go to what I would call understanding risk part 2. And this isn't necessarily going to help you explain it to your client, but it is going to help you understand where the fear is coming from with your client. And that is the notion, and I want to give you a new word, the notion of indeterminism. Now that's a fancy word that basically means this: we don't know what the future holds. As much as we can try to minimize and try to control the future, we really don't know what the future holds. For example, you could be exercising and being fit and in shape and running marathons or whatever you think makes someone a healthy person. But that still doesn't mean you're not going to get hit by a bus. Or there are a lot of healthy people who've died of heart attacks. Why? Because they were genetically predisposed. There was nothing they were going to do that was going to basically help them dodge that bullet. Now, I'm not encouraging you to say, well, everything's just a matter of the fates and do whatever you want and become, fatalists on this. No. But the point is that there's a limit to what we can do. There's a lot of things in our life we simply cannot control. So when we talk about indeterminism, in other words, we don't know the future, we have to see this as basically 2 elements. There's 2 elements to indeterminance. We've already talked about one element, and that's the nature of chance. That's where I discussed in Understanding Risk Part 1 that risk equals probability times severity times exposure, or probability times toxicity times exposure. That's the chance side of indeterminism. But we also have what we call the epistemic side of indeterminism. Now, epistemic, again, I'm using some big words here, but let me kind of break this out for you. At the epistemic side of risk is talking about how we don't know what we don't know. Let me give you an illustration. I was doing some field work here in Montana, and we were out in the field doing a study. And lo and behold, while I was out in the field, I was doing some other work, and I'm looking, and all of a sudden I see a dog running through our field. And the closest house was at least a quarter of a mile, maybe even a half mile away from our location. It never even dawned on me to be thinking about having a dog running through my test site. So there was something I didn't even know that was a potential risk for the site that we had chose. So there's an example of where if you're using a pesticide in someone's house and you think you have tried to minimize the risk to those homeowners, and the homeowners say, oh yeah, no one's going to be here, we're going to be fine. And all of a sudden, their college kid comes home early from college and has a key to the house and walks in. That's an epistemic risk because the parents didn't know that the child was going to come home. Nor did you know that the child was going to come home. So that's something that you didn't even know that you should know it. That aspect of what we don't know, that aspect is really I believe, at the root of a lot of fear governing pesticide use, is that people don't trust the research, the scientists, about what we do know about pesticides. And so therefore, they hear these stories on the internet and they say, well, you say that this is, I know we're not calling any pesticide safe, but you're saying that this is an appropriate use and we've minimized these risks and the risks are very manageable, but they don't trust you. And not because they don't trust you as a person, that they think you're lying. That's not what they're thinking. But they don't trust the science and the research behind it because they don't think that the scientists have done research over a long enough period of time. They always think that their situation is special. They may say, well, I know someone down the road who had that same pesticide sprayed, and all of a sudden that house had a cluster of cancer kids. May have been nothing involved, not even remotely related to that particular pesticide, but that doesn't matter to their minds. They think the connection is there because in the public, correlation means causation. So let's recap this a little bit. We've talked about understanding risk part 1, which was that risk is probability times toxicity times exposure. That's the chance side of indeterminism. Understanding risk part 1. But then I talked about that the second part of risk, that indeterminism, that we don't know the future, is the epistemic side, that we don't know what we don't know. Let me give you another aspect of this epistemic side. How often have you told clients, you say, we're going to try this, but I want you to know that if we do this, this negative element may happen. Now, it may not even be that serious. Let's say a pesticide that you're using could cause, let's say, skin irritation. And let's say it's minor skin irritation. I don't have any particular pesticide in mind. I'm just trying to throw out an example that's kind of neutral, okay? So whatever the pesticide is, we'll just say pesticide XYZ, that when you use it, a certain percentage of residents at a house that you're using will suffer some moderate skin irritation. Maybe they get a small rash or something. I don't know. We'll just say a small rash, something innocuous. It's not going to hurt them over the long term. It goes away, but it's irritating in the short term. You may tell your client this and say, the research shows there's a 5% chance that you could get this rash. And the customer says, I don't care. I need these bugs gone or whatever it is. And they sign the document and then you go away and you apply the product. And all of a sudden, a few days later, you're getting a phone call and they're screaming at you on the phone saying, why do I have this rash? And you explained to them, you said, well, we told you there was a small risk that you could get this rash. Don't worry, it'll go away in about 7 days. And, this is completely normal and everything's fine. But they're screaming at you and they're threatening to sue. Now, what happened there? Now, there's an example of where we knew that it was a possibility that it could happen. But you see, your client didn't adequately, they thought they were going to be the exception. They thought they were going to be part of that 95%. And so therefore, they were angry that they were part of the 5%. That's that part of your epistemic risk, that even when you inform your client, it doesn't mean your client, that you know how your client's going to react if something goes wrong. Doctors have the same challenge that they have. If you ever have surgery, you sign your life away in those surgeries. You're telling them you may die on the operating table, the anesthesia could kill you. It's scary stuff when you read those things. Okay, I've had several surgeries. If you read the details, you're like, oh my gosh, what am I signing here? It's scary stuff. So I'm an informed patient, but I still go through the surgery. Why? Because I think I'm going to beat the odds. Right? Your client is going to be the same way because they suppress that negative information that they have. Now, this doesn't help us help our client, right? I mean, in the sense that how do we help our client get a better understanding of risk? My point here is I want you to at least emotionally and mentally try to understand risk from your client's point of view so that when you encounter this problem, you're not blown away by it. I wish I had an ABC method to solve it, but I don't. I think this is one of the most difficult parts of being in the wildlife control business or the pest control business, because how do we explain the unknown to clients? They're under stress already, they're angry, they're upset about having this pest problem, they have to spend money on this thing, and they're talking to you, and it's interfering with their life. So they're already angry in many situations, they're upset, and now you're telling them about the potential negatives, and then their mind gets going. How do we deal with this? And this is the part of the business where you become what I call a therapist, where you're not just simply a bug killer or an animal killer, you are a therapist helping your client walk through this unknown, this scary element. You have to create an atmosphere of informed consent where you help them not take counsel of irrational fears. And I wish I had a better way of doing it, but you need to understand that part of their fear is that epistemic risk. We don't know what we don't know. And the second part of that epistemic risk is, how do we know, will the client react the way they say they're going to act? Because you've probably had clients say, oh, I don't care about that. That's fine. I don't care if that spray discolors the surface of that object. And then all of a sudden it's discolored and they're screaming at you. Why did the client change their mind on that? That's your epistemic risk. Just because the client says they're going to act in a certain way, doesn't mean the client will actually act that way when that event occurs. So I hope you get a sense of just how complicated this concept of risk actually is. And so how do we help people talk about it? And this is something, I have a third aspect to risk, but I'm not going to get into that on this particular podcast. I think I've already hit you with a lot. So how do we give some strategies to you to help you walk your client through this tightrope of risk reward so that you don't lose jobs, but that you're not also diminishing the real risks that are there, because you don't want to do that either. Here's some things that have helped me, or at least I think they have, when I've talked to people on the phone or I've talked to them about the nature of risk. I try to give them a little bit of background information about the pesticide that they're thinking about using or that's going to be used. To give them a sense of understanding, because knowledge gives, the more people can sometimes understand about something, within limits, it gives them a greater sense of control, so that they have an awareness of what this pesticide can do and what this pesticide cannot do. The other thing you want to do is try to compare the risk that they may encounter. By risk, we mean the negative things that could happen, to things that are really risky for them, that they've downplayed. Sometimes I've had to tell people, I would say, there is more risk to you right now from your neighbor's dog than what I'm doing here. Now, they don't believe me a lot of times, or they won't believe me, or maybe your clients won't believe you, because they think they know their dog. I mean, I've had people ask me, well, do you know this is going to happen? And I'll say, well, the answer is no. And then I'll look at them and I'll say, how do you know your neighbor's not going to rob you tomorrow? And they'll look at me and they'll think about it and they're like, well, yeah, they don't know whether their neighbor's going to rob them tomorrow. I said, your neighbor probably won't rob you tomorrow because you probably know your neighbor. But how do you know for sure? So what you're doing is you're giving them an understanding that our knowledge is always in part. We often don't have 100% knowledge, but you're also telling them that, look, they do all kinds of things in their life that they don't have 100% knowledge of, and they have no fear whatsoever. And so what you have to do sometimes is you have to give them a little bit of fear about something else that they think they know a lot about to help compensate for the excessive fear about something that you know a lot about. Now, I wish that was a slam dunk to help your client have an informed consent, because you have to balance the need to make sure your client's informed, but also get the job done, because, hey, time is money, right? I mean, so this is a rather abstract conversation I'm having today, but it's something I think that's important to just simply chew on from time to time and think, how can I help my clients overcome some of these fears? And this may be, you may want to have literature that you hand to your client. Maybe you're going to give them the SDS sheet. Maybe you're going to give them a little company brochure. Maybe you're going to give them the label of the product that you're using. Maybe you're going to look up some research on this particular product to help your client overcome some of these fears. Or maybe you're going to say, okay, client, I'm going to give you some options. Maybe there's pesticide 1 that you like, and maybe there's pesticide 2 that would be safer, but maybe not quite as effective. And you can explain those differences and let the client own some of that risk and own some of those choices. Sometimes letting the client make a decision helps them overcome some of that fear by helping them feel a little bit more that they're still in control of a situation that they wish they weren't in to begin with. Well, again, I've covered some rather abstract concepts, but let me kind of recap it all again for you in terms of the understanding and explaining risk. And I said, risk can be understood at a very basic level as risk equals the probability times toxicity times exposure. But then I said, that's not enough. There's more to risk than just simply understanding the chance side of risk. There's also the epistemic side. That is, we really don't know what we don't know, nor do we often know how we really are going to respond when a theoretical becomes actual. When you warn the client about that spray may leave a film on the furniture, and then they see it for real, and then they're angry, even though they were completely informed. So understanding awareness of those two elements of risk, the unknown and the probability side of risk, hopefully will help you tease out some of the concerns that your client may not even be able to conceptualize, because all they see is fear. A fear that something more is going to go wrong than has already gone wrong, which is why they called you in the first place. I hope that helps. At least you can help you conceptualize where some of this is occurring so that you can help your clients navigate that risk-reward challenge. I'm Stephen Van Tassel for Wildlife Control Consultant. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.